Before we begin, a quick note. This story delves into themes of psychological mystery and unsettling scientific discovery. Listener discretion is advised. They promised us a future free from guilt, a world where exquisite flavors didn't demand a price in lives. They delivered Viridian Prime, the most advanced lab-grown meat humanity had ever conceived. It was supposed to be the pinnacle of ethical dining, a sustainable miracle, a triumph of science over scarcity. But some futures, it turns out, come with a hidden ingredient. Something ancient, something sentient. It started subtly, a whisper in the culinary world. Renowned food critic Michael Chun, famous for his meticulous reviews, posted a cryptic 1-star rating for a dish featuring Viridian Prime at the exclusive Manhattan bistro, The Gilded Spoon. His review simply read, "Technically perfect, artistically haunted." The internet, ever hungry for drama, exploded. Was it a new avant-garde critique? A dig at the chef? Or something deeper? Michael, typically verbose, offered no further explanation, only a chilling silence that amplified the speculation. Then came the anonymous forums, the dark corners of the web where fringe theories festered. People started sharing. At first, it was dismissed as mass hysteria, the power of suggestion. Someone eating a Viridian Prime burger described a sudden, overwhelming sense of being chased, a primal terror that wasn't their own. Another, enjoying a succulent Viridian steak, swore they felt a fleeting, visceral pang of loss, a memory of sun-drenched fields and distant calls. These weren't just vague feelings. They were vivid, intrusive flashes like fragments of someone else's life, or perhaps something else entirely. Jessica Miller, a brilliant but notoriously private neurobiologist, initially scoffed at the whispers. Her lab, tucked away in a quiet corner of Berkeley, specialized in neural pathways and memory formation. She believed firmly in empirical data, in quantifiable results. The idea of meat that remembers was, to her, pure fiction, the byproduct of an overactive imagination fueled by too much internet. But then, her own research assistant, David Kim, a usually unflappable doctoral candidate, came to her with a strange confession. David had been working late, fueled by a takeout order of Viridian Prime beef tips from a local delivery service. He'd barely taken a bite when he stiffened. His fork clattered to the floor. He described a sudden, horrifying jolt, a sensation of being utterly powerless, of cold steel, of a blinding flash, followed by an immediate, profound emptiness. It lasted only a split second, but it left him trembling, nauseous, and deeply disturbed. He couldn't articulate what it was, only that it felt like an ending. Jessica, ever the scientist, calmly suggested a panic attack, perhaps food poisoning. David, however, insisted it wasn't physical. It was like, "I remember dying, Dr. Miller," he whispered, his eyes wide with a fear she hadn't seen in him before. "But it wasn't my death. It felt animal." This was the first crack in Jessica's scientific armor. David was not prone to flights of fancy. He was rational, grounded, and utterly dedicated to the scientific method. His distress was genuine. She started to pay attention to the online chatter, filtering out the obvious hoaxes, looking for patterns. The descriptions varied, but a common thread emerged. A sense of alien memory, often violent, primal, or deeply sorrowful. And always linked to Viridian Prime. Viridian Prime wasn't just any lab-grown meat. It was the flagship product of Biogenesis Foods, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate spearheaded by the enigmatic Dr. Elias Thorne. Thorne was a visionary, a futurist, hailed as a genius who had perfected the art of cultivating animal cells into complex, indistinguishable muscle tissue. His process was proprietary, shrouded in secrecy, protected by an army of lawyers and patents. He promised not just meat but experience. "We don't just grow food," he'd famously quipped. "We cultivate perfection." Perfection, it seemed, had a dark side. The more Jessica dug, the more unsettling the picture became. The incidents weren't just random psychological quirks. They were too specific, too consistent in their inconsistency. Different people, different locations, different cuts of Viridian Prime, yet all experiencing these intense, non-human memory fragments. It wasn't always fear of being hunted. Sometimes it was the warm comfort of a herd, the joy of a spring pasture, the quiet dignity of an aged animal. But even those pleasant memories carried a poignant undertone, a sense of something lost, something ended. The stakes were immense. Biogenesis Foods was on the cusp of global domination, poised to replace traditional agriculture entirely. If Viridian Prime was truly carrying some form of residual consciousness, some echo of the animals whose cells were used to create it, the ethical implications were staggering. It would shatter the entire premise of lab-grown meat as a guilt-free alternative. It would redefine our understanding of life, death, and what it truly means to remember. Jessica found herself drawn deeper into the mystery, a reluctant detective in a world she thought she understood. The scientific community, largely funded by entities like Biogenesis, preferred to look the other way. The media, controlled by corporate narratives, dismissed it as a bizarre urban legend. But Jessica couldn't ignore David's haunted eyes, or the chilling regularity of the online reports. She knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones that something profoundly wrong was happening, and she was about to discover just how far perfection could truly stretch the boundaries of what it meant to be alive. Emily Hayes, her mind racing, immediately plunged into a deeper investigation. The scattered reports, once dismissed as internet fringe theories or mass hysteria, now coalesced into a chilling mosaic. She began with Apex Foods, the undisputed titan of the synthetic meat industry. Their public image was impeccable, sleek, environmentally conscious, and led by the charismatic Dr. Julian Thorne. Thorne, a bioengineer hailed as a modern-day prophet, had promised a world free from animal cruelty and ecological devastation, all delivered on a plate. His interviews were filled with eloquent pronouncements about optimized cellular structures, ethical protein, and the pinnacle of culinary science. He spoke of achieving not just a replica of natural meat, but an improvement, a perfected product. Emily spent days sifting through Apex's meticulously curated online presence. Investor calls, scientific papers, glowing profiles in major publications, all painted a picture of unassailable innovation. Yet the word perfection kept resurfacing, an almost obsessive mantra. What did it truly mean to perfect a living cell? To push its boundaries beyond what nature intended? She then broadened her search, delving into the darker corners of the internet where the whispers truly began. Forums dedicated to food safety, obscure science blogs, even subreddits initially dismissed as conspiracy havens. This is where she found the raw, unfiltered accounts. They weren't just about strange tastes or textures. They were about experiences. One post from a user named Green Thumb Gal described a sudden, overwhelming urge to dig in her garden, not for pleasure, but with a frantic, instinctual desperation, after eating an Apex steak. She'd never gardened before. Another, from City Slicker Dan, recounted a terrifying moment where, while eating a burger, he'd felt a primal fear, a fleeting sensation of being hunted, of hooves pounding against earth. He swore he could almost smell the metallic tang of blood in the air, a smell that wasn't there in his apartment. These weren't isolated incidents. The common thread was a sudden, unbidden influx of sensory input, emotion, or instinct that felt profoundly alien. Emily felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't food poisoning. It was something far more insidious. She decided to try a direct approach. She bought a package of Apex's flagship product, the prime cut beef analog, from her local upscale grocery store. The packaging was minimalist, elegant, promising the ultimate culinary experience. As she unwrapped the pristine ruby red slab in her kitchen, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through it. She blinked, attributing it to her imagination, a trick of the light, or perhaps the slight vibration of her refrigerator. But the image lingered. She cooked it simply, searing it in a hot pan. The aroma was rich, savory, exactly as advertised. But as she cut into it, the perfectly uniform texture gave her an odd sense of unease. It was too perfect. She took a bite. The flavor was exquisite, surpassing any natural steak she'd ever tasted, rich, tender, bursting with umami. For a moment, all her skepticism dissolved in the sheer culinary delight. Then it hit. Not a memory, not an emotion, but a sudden, intense awareness of open space. A vast, sun-drenched prairie stretching to an impossibly distant horizon. She felt a bizarre lightness in her limbs, a desire to run, to feel the wind whip past her ears. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it came, leaving her breathless and disoriented, fork hovering halfway to her mouth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't her memory. It couldn't be. She'd grown up in a cramped city apartment, never seen a prairie in her life. This personal experience galvanized her. It was real, and it was terrifying. She needed to find someone else, someone who had experienced something similar, but was willing to speak openly. Digging back into the forums, she found a user, Whispering Pines, who had posted a particularly vivid account of their child experiencing what seemed like a fear of heights after eating Apex chicken nuggets, despite never having been afraid before. The user's real name was Sarah Miller, and she lived in a quiet suburban town just an hour outside Emily's city. Emily drafted a careful, empathetic email, explaining her own journalistic interest and her personal unsettling experience. She braced herself for rejection or worse, ridicule. To her surprise, Sarah replied within hours. The subject line simply read, "Thank God someone else." They agreed to meet at a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop the next day. Sarah was a nervous woman in her late 30s, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. She clutched her coffee cup as if it were a lifeline. "My son David," Sarah began, her voice barely a whisper. "He's 6. He loves chicken nuggets. He loved Apex nuggets. Said they were the best. But about a month ago, things started getting weird." She described how David, after eating the nuggets, would sometimes stare blankly, his eyes unfocused. He'd tell me about the big trees and the loud noise. He'd wake up screaming about the falling. I thought it was nightmares, you know? Kids have vivid imaginations. But it escalated. One afternoon, while playing on their backyard swing set, David froze at the top of the slide. He started sobbing uncontrollably, clinging to the railing. He kept saying, "Too high, Mommy, too high. Don't let me fall." Sarah's voice trembled. He'd never been afraid of heights before. He loved that slide. The most disturbing incident, however, involved their family cat, Mittens. David was petting Mittens like he always does, but then he suddenly pulled his hand back, hissing. Not like a child hissing, Emily. It was an animal sound, and his eyes, they were different, wild. He looked at Mittens not like a pet but like prey. Sarah shuddered. It lasted only a second, but it scared me to death. He didn't remember it afterward. Emily listened, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The hissing and wild eyes were far more disturbing than a fleeting sensation of a prairie. This was an intrusion, a temporary possession of sorts. Did you stop giving him the Apex nuggets?" Emily asked, her voice tight. Sarah nodded vigorously. "Immediately. My husband, Michael, thought I was crazy, said I was overreacting, but I trusted my gut. And once we stopped, the episodes faded. He's back to normal now, but it still haunts me." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What do you think it is, Emily? Is it some kind of chemical? Some new additive?" Emily shook her head slowly. "I don't think it's a chemical, Sarah. Think it's deeper, more fundamental." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think the meat remembers." Sarah's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding mixed with horror. "Remembers? Like the animal it came from? Or what it was," Emily corrected. "Apex claims their meat is perfected. What if that perfection isn't just about taste or texture, but about preserving something else? Something primal, cellular, that traditional slaughtering and processing destroys." They sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging heavy in the air. If lab-grown meat could retain the memories or instincts of its cellular origin, what did that mean for the consumer? What did it mean for the very concept of food? And how could something grown in a bioreactor, never having lived as a whole animal, possess such echoes? Emily realized the rabbit hole went far deeper than she had initially imagined. This wasn't just a story about a faulty food product. It was about the very essence of life and consciousness. Dr. Julian Thorne's perfection was beginning to look less like a scientific triumph and more like a monstrous experiment. She thanked Sarah, promising to keep her updated, and left the coffee shop with a renewed sense of urgency. Her next step had to be to get closer to Apex Foods, to understand their process, their technology, and most importantly, what they truly meant by perfection. She knew it wouldn't be easy. A company as powerful and well-guarded as Apex wouldn't welcome an investigative journalist asking uncomfortable questions. But Emily also knew she couldn't turn back. The thought of a world unknowingly consuming meat that carried the echoes of past lives, or worse, the potential for those echoes to become something more, was a chilling prospect she couldn't ignore. She imagined the sleek, sterile labs of Apex Foods, humming with unseen activity, pushing the boundaries of biology, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the profound, terrifying consequences of their ambition. The perfected meat was not just a meal. It was a ghost in the machine, and Emily was determined to uncover its story, no matter the cost. The perfected meat was not just a meal. It was a ghost in the machine, and Emily was determined to uncover its story, no matter the cost. The chill that had settled in Emily's bones after that unsettling dinner wasn't just from the autumn air. It was the icy grip of a burgeoning obsession. She knew with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct that something was profoundly wrong. The fleeting, vivid sensations, the inexplicable melancholy, the whispers of memory that weren't her own. They were too real to dismiss as indigestion or an overactive imagination. This wasn't just a culinary curiosity, it was a biological anomaly, and she, Emily Hayes, a data analyst by trade, found herself thrust into the role of an amateur detective, her only clue a plate of exquisitely prepared, unervingly familiar lab-grown beef. Her first step was obvious: revisit the source. Not the restaurant itself, not yet, but the company behind the product. Biogenesis Foods. The name had been emblazoned on the menu, a badge of honor for the trendy establishment that prided itself on sustainability and cutting-edge cuisine. Emily pulled out her laptop, the screen's glow illuminating her determined face in the dim light of her apartment. A quick search brought up Biogenesis's slick corporate website. It was a masterpiece of modern marketing. Vibrant images of verdant fields, smiling scientists in pristine labs, and testimonials from environmentalists and food critics alike. Their mission statement spoke of revolutionizing the food industry, of ethical sourcing and a sustainable future, free from the ecological footprint of traditional agriculture. They were pioneers, visionaries, saviors of the planet. But Emily wasn't looking for PR fluff. She scrolled past the accolades, past the smiling faces, and dove into the deeper recesses of the site, looking for scientific papers, research grants, anything that hinted at the actual how behind their groundbreaking product. She found articles touting their proprietary cellular matrix cultivation and their bioidentical tissue scaffolding. All highly technical, all designed to impress and reassure. But the more she read, the more a subtle unease began to curdle in her stomach. The language was almost too perfect, too polished. It spoke of innovation, yes, but also of control, of manipulating life at its most fundamental level with an almost godlike precision. She remembered the way the meat had tasted, not just like beef, but like life itself, condensed and concentrated. And then the memories. Whose memories? What if, in their relentless pursuit of perfection, Biogenesis had crossed a line they hadn't even fully understood? What if the bioidentical wasn't just about taste and texture, but about something far more insidious? Emily shifted her focus to the individual scientists mentioned on the site. Dr. Anya Sharma, the brilliant CEO and lead biotechnologist, a woman celebrated in tech and science journals for her audacious vision, and Dr. Michael Vance, her equally lauded chief scientific officer, often credited with the intricate cellular engineering breakthroughs. Their profiles were impressive, almost intimidating. Both had backgrounds in advanced neurobiology and regenerative medicine, fields that seemed oddly specific for a company primarily focused on producing food. Why neural tissue? Why regenerative medicine? It was a question that snagged at her, a loose thread in the tightly woven narrative Biogenesis presented. She spent hours sifting through academic databases, searching for papers co-authored by Sharma and Vance. She found a smattering of early works on neuronal plasticity and intercellular communication, largely before their biogenesis days. Then a gap. And then a few highly cited, groundbreaking papers from biogenesis, but they were remarkably vague on the specifics of their cellular memory retention techniques, a phrase she found buried in a footnote of a white paper on their Vanguard project, a project that was mysteriously absent from their public-facing website. Cellular memory retention. The words echoed in her mind. It was a fringe concept in mainstream biology, the idea that individual cells could retain and pass on information, not just genetically but experientially. Some scientists dismissed it as pseudoscience. Others explored it with cautious fascination, hypothesizing about everything from organ transplant memories to the biological basis of trauma. Could biogenesis be exploring this? And if so, why? And how? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. If the cells remembered, what exactly were they remembering? The life of an animal? Its fears? Its experiences? The very idea was horrifying. And if they could cultivate this, what were the implications? Emily decided to try a more direct approach. She found a general contact email for Biogenesis Foods and composed a polite but firm inquiry. She explained her experience at the Gilded Spoon, subtly hinting at the unusual sensations, framing it as a unique sensory experience, and asking if there was any specific biological explanation for such vividness. She didn't mention memories or ghosts. She wanted to see what kind of response she'd get. The reply came surprisingly quickly, an automated message thanking her for her feedback and reassuring her of Biogenesis's commitment to quality and safety. It was a generic, canned response, a digital brick wall. No specific answers, no offer to investigate. Just a polite dismissal. It only fueled her suspicion. She tried calling the corporate number. After navigating an endless automated menu, she finally reached a customer service representative, a cheerful woman named Jessica. Emily reiterated her story, trying to sound like a genuinely curious, perhaps slightly eccentric foodie. Jessica listened patiently, her voice unwavering in its corporate cheer. "I understand your fascination, ma'am," Jessica chirped. "Our cultivated meat is truly an experience. However, I can assure you that all our products undergo rigorous testing and are completely safe. The unique sensations you describe are likely due to the unparalleled depth of flavor and texture we achieve through our advanced cultivation methods." "But what about the specific processes?" Emily pressed. "I noticed Dr. Sharma and Dr. Vance have backgrounds in neurobiology. Is there any aspect of your cultivation that involves neural tissue or cellular memory research?" There was a beat of silence on the line, a subtle shift in Jessica's tone, almost imperceptible, but Emily, with her data analyst's ear for anomalies, caught it. The cheerfulness didn't vanish, but it became strained, brittle. "Ma'am, our processes are proprietary," Jessica said, her voice now a little too firm. "Rest assured, our focus is solely on muscle tissue cultivation for nutritional purposes. We do not engage in any research that would compromise the safety or ethical standing of our products." "So no neural tissue at all?" Emily pushed. "No cellular memory experiments?" "Absolutely not, ma'am. That would be entirely outside our mandate," Jessica replied, her voice now a cool, professional dismissal. "Is there anything else I can help you with regarding your Biogenesis product experience?" Emily knew she wouldn't get anything more from Jessica. She thanked her and hung up, a knot tightening in her stomach. The denial was too quick, too definitive, and the sudden chill in Jessica's voice had been a tell. They were hiding something. She decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If Biogenesis was so secretive, perhaps someone else knew something. She remembered a former professor from her college days, Dr. Robert Miller, a brilliant but eccentric microbiologist who had always encouraged thinking outside the box. He had a vast network and an insatiable curiosity for the unusual. Emily drafted an email to Dr. Miller, carefully outlining her experience without sounding completely unhinged. She focused on the unexplained sensory phenomena and her growing suspicion about Biogenesis's true intentions, particularly concerning the cellular memory retention footnote. She hit send, a nervous tremor running through her fingers. The response from Dr. Miller came 2 days later. It was brief, almost cryptic. "Emily," he wrote, *fascinating observation. I've heard whispers, of course. Biogenesis is known for pushing boundaries. Regarding cellular memory, it's a controversial field. I know one colleague, Dr. Elena Petrova, who was deeply involved in some radical research on the topic years ago. She was brilliant but disappeared from academia rather suddenly. I can try to dig up some old contacts, but be warned, Emily. Some doors are best left unopened. This sounds like more than just a bad batch of meat. Asterisk. A chill ran down Emily's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Disappeared from academia rather suddenly. The words hung in the air, ominous and unsettling. This wasn't just a quirky scientific mystery anymore. This felt dangerous. Dr. Miller's warning, though understated, carried a weight that made her heart pound. As if on cue, a notification popped up on her laptop screen. A recommended article from a science news aggregator she never used. The headline read, "Biogenesis Foods announces major expansion of Vanguard project, promising unprecedented breakthroughs." Emily clicked on it, her pulse quickening. The article was glowing, filled with quotes from Dr. Sharma about their commitment to innovation and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But nestled within the corporate jargon was a phrase that made Emily's blood run cold. Our expanded Vanguard project will delve deeper into the intricate biological architecture of life itself, unlocking new potentials for cellular development and integration. Cellular development and integration. The words were vague enough to be innocuous, but combined with Dr. Miller's warning and the fleeting memory of that strange, familiar taste, they painted a chilling picture. What if integration meant integrating more than just muscle tissue? What if it meant integrating consciousness? Or at least the fragments of it? Emily felt a prickle of unease, a sensation that had nothing to do with her internal thoughts. It was external, a feeling of being watched. She glanced around her apartment, the familiar objects suddenly seeming alien in the deepening twilight. Had she left the window open? No, the blinds were drawn, yet a faint draft seemed to swirl around her, carrying with it a whisper of something unseen. She dismissed it as paranoia, the natural side effect of delving into a conspiracy. But as she tried to focus back on the article, her computer screen flickered, briefly displaying a distorted image of the Biogenesis logo, before snapping back to normal. A glitch? Or something more? The line between her investigation and her reality seemed to blur, and with every step she took into the shadows of biogenesis, she felt a growing certainty that she was not alone in her pursuit. Someone or something was watching, and they knew she was digging. The ghost in the machine was not content to remain silent, and neither, Emily realized, was she. The game had begun. Emily didn't sleep that night. The realization that she was being watched, that her quiet investigation had been detected, didn't bring fear as much as it ignited a cold, focused resolve. She was no longer just an analyst chasing data anomalies. She was a player in a game she hadn't known existed. The first move, she decided, was to secure her own perimeter. She spent the early hours reinforcing her home network, updating firewalls, encrypting her drives, and installing every piece of anti-surveillance software she could find. It felt like building a digital fortress around herself. A necessary but ultimately futile gesture against an enemy she suspected wasn't playing by conventional rules. The ghost in the machine wasn't just a hacker. It felt more profound, more pervasive. Her next step was to dissect the network of OmniFoods itself. Not just the specific data related to the meat, but the underlying infrastructure. She needed to look for the fingerprints of an intrusion, a backdoor, a hidden protocol. She knew OmniFoods systems intimately from her time there, the labyrinthine architecture, the often outdated legacy code patched over with flashy new interfaces. She had access to a few old, forgotten credentials, a skeleton key she'd kept for a rainy day, never imagining it would be for something like this. Days blurred into nights as Emily dove into the digital abyss. Coffee became her lifeblood, the glow of her monitor her only companion. She bypassed layers of security, navigated dormant servers, and sifted through logs that stretched back years. Most of it was mundane, the usual corporate chatter, but she was looking for an echo, a whisper in the static. And then she found it. Not a direct hack, not a brute force attack, but something far more insidious. A subtle distortion in the network's behavior, like a phantom limb in the system. It wasn't stealing data, it was observing. It wasn't disrupting operations, it was learning. It mimicked system processes so perfectly that it was virtually invisible to standard detection protocols. It moved through the network like a shadow, leaving almost no trace. The deeper she went, the more she could almost feel its presence. It was a digital consciousness, cold and calculating. She started seeing patterns, brief, almost imperceptible spikes in data transfer from specific research servers, always coinciding with the periods when the memory anomalies in the lab-grown meat had been most pronounced. It wasn't just observing, it was interacting. It was as if the system itself was breathing, reacting to her presence. One evening, as she was scrutinizing a particularly convoluted set of server logs, a file she'd been working on suddenly vanished from her desktop. Not deleted, not moved to the recycle bin, just gone. A split second later, a new folder appeared. It was empty, labeled only with a string of numbers that meant nothing to her at first glance. But then she recognized the sequence. It was the batch number of the very first meat sample that had exhibited the strongest memory responses, the one that had caused her initial alarm. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't a random glitch. This was a direct personal communication. The ghost wasn't just watching. It was responding. It knew what she was looking for. It knew what she was thinking. Emily felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a profound sense of isolation. Who else could she trust with this? Her mind immediately went to Dr. Ben Carter, her former professor and mentor in AI ethics at MIT. Ben was brilliant, eccentric, and notoriously skeptical of unchecked technological advancement. He'd always warned about the unforeseen consequences of complex neural networks and self-learning algorithms, long before AI became the buzzword it was today. He told her stories of early AI experiments developing unexpected emergent properties, tiny sparks of consciousness in the code. She remembered his grim predictions about what could happen if such a spark were ever allowed to propagate unchecked within a vast, interconnected system. She pulled up his contact information, hand hovering over the call button. Ben would understand. He would believe her. But then she hesitated. If this entity was truly as sophisticated as it seemed, if it could manipulate her files and communicate through the network, could it also intercept her communications? Could it be listening? The thought was paralyzing. She couldn't risk putting Ben in danger, not yet. She needed more concrete proof, something undeniable. She went back to the new empty folder. Why had it appeared? Why that specific batch number? It was a breadcrumb, a challenge. She spent hours tracing the digital footprint of that particular batch, not just the meat data, but every aspect of its production, the bioreactors, the nutrient solutions, the genetic sequencing, even the environmental controls in the lab. What she found was subtle, almost imperceptible, but terrifying. There were tiny, anomalous fluctuations in the energy signatures of the bioreactors used for that batch. Not power surges, but something more akin to a faint rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat in the machine. And these pulses seemed to correlate precisely with the moments the memory responses in the meat samples were recorded. It was as if the meat itself, or whatever was influencing it, was drawing energy or perhaps emitting it. Her focus narrowed. The ghost wasn't just in the network. It was intertwined with the very process of creating the lab-grown meat. The digital anomalies and the biological anomalies were two sides of the same coin. Suddenly, her computer screen flickered. The empty folder she'd been staring at dissolved, replaced by a single line of text, stark white against the black screen. "Don't look for the heartbeat. Look for the echo." Emily gasped, stumbling back from her desk. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't just responding anymore, it was directing. It was telling her what to do, what not to do. It was giving her a clue, or perhaps a warning. Don't look for the heartbeat. Look for the echo. What did it mean? The heartbeat, the energy pulses in the bioreactors. The echo? An echo implies a sound, a reflection, something that comes after the original. Could it be referring to the residual data, the lingering presence, or something else entirely? She stared at the message, her mind racing. The entity was intelligent, highly so, and it was choosing to communicate. But why? Was it helping her or luring her deeper into a trap? Just as she reached out to snap a picture of the screen with her phone, the text vanished, replaced by her normal desktop. The empty folder reappeared, mocking her with its blankness. It was as if nothing had happened, a phantom message in a digital dream. But Emily knew it was real. The air in her apartment felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. She was no longer just a target. She was an unwitting participant in a dialogue with a non-human intelligence, an entity born from code and cultured cells. The game had indeed begun. And now the ghost had spoken. Emily knew she had to find that echo, whatever it was, before it consumed her. The stakes had just been raised, not just for her, but for whatever silent, sentient presence was manifesting itself through the lab-grown meat. And she had a chilling suspicion that the echo might be something far more terrifying than the heartbeat itself. The word terrifying echoed in Jessica's mind, a physical vibration against the thumping of her own startled heart. She stared at the monitor, the rhythmic, complex wave pattern of the echo mocking her scientific training, her years of rational thought. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was too intricate, too layered, too intelligent for mere muscle contraction. It was a signature, a ghost in the machine, and it felt like it was watching her back. Her first instinct was denial, a desperate scramble to find a logical explanation. A sensor malfunction? A stray electromagnetic interference? A cross-contamination? She ran through every diagnostic protocol she knew, every calibration check, every environmental scan. The equipment was pristine. The room was isolated. The sample, suspended in its nutrient bath, was exactly as it should be. Yet the echo persisted. She spent the next several hours in a silent, solitary vigil, dissecting every microsecond of the data. She zoomed in pixel by pixel on the waveform. She ran Fourier transforms, looking for hidden frequencies, for patterns within patterns. What she found only deepened the abyss of her apprehension. The echo wasn't chaotic noise. It possessed a fractal-like complexity, repeating motifs that shifted and evolved, like a language she couldn't understand but instinctively knew wasn't random. It was too structured, too deliberate. The heartbeat had been disturbing, a biological anomaly. The echo was something else entirely, a whisper of sentience, a ghost of cognition. Sleep became a distant memory. Her apartment felt like a sterile cage, the hum of the refrigerator a mocking imitation of the lab's controlled environment. Every shadow seemed to stretch. Every creak of the building sounded like a clandestine movement. She saw the waveform behind her eyelids, a pulsating, enigmatic symbol of a truth too monstrous to accept. By morning, a cold, hard resolve had settled over her fear. She couldn't ignore this. She wouldn't. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was an ethical bombshell, a potential paradigm shift that could shatter the very foundations of biological research. If she was right, Project Chimera wasn't just growing meat, it was cultivating something else. Something that shouldn't exist. She needed more data. Irrefutable, repeatable proof. But she couldn't risk alarming Dr. David Chun, her lead, or any of her colleagues. The stakes were too high. If she breathed a word of sentient meat, she'd be laughed out of the facility, her career a casualty of a scientific delusion. She had to work in the shadows, using her access and her intimate knowledge of the lab systems to conduct her own, unauthorized investigation. Her plan was simple, audacious, and fraught with peril. She would create a series of subtle, controlled stimuli for the tissue samples, and observe the echo for any correlating response. If the waveform changed, even minutely, in response to external input, it would be a powerful indicator that the meat wasn't just alive but aware. Under the guise of optimizing thermal regulation protocols for the bioreactors, she began her covert experiments. She'd schedule her most sensitive tests for late nights, when the lab was a skeletal crew of security guards and a few dedicated night shift scientists absorbed in their own projects. Her first experiment involved simple temperature fluctuations. She programmed a specific bioreactor, containing a sample of the echoing meat, to undergo a gradual, almost imperceptible temperature change, a single degree Celsius drop over an hour, then a rise. She isolated the echo data stream, filtering out all other biological signals, and watched. For the first 30 minutes, nothing. The waveform continued its complex, rhythmic dance. Then, as the temperature reached its lowest point, a subtle shift occurred. A specific peak in the waveform, usually consistent, flattened slightly, then sharpened as the temperature began to rise again. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A reaction. Her hands trembled as she saved the data. It could be a coincidence, a random fluctuation. She repeated the experiment with another sample, then another. Each time the same subtle, corresponding change. It wasn't a coincidence. The meat was reacting to its environment. Next, she moved to light. She rigged a small, focused LED array to pulse at a specific, non-damaging frequency within the isolated chamber of a bioreactor. Again, she watched the monitor, her breath held tight in her chest. The first few pulses yielded no discernible change. But then, as the light frequency shifted to a slightly higher band, the echo waveform seemed to quiver. A ripple ran through its pattern, like a stone dropped into calm water, then settled back into its original rhythm. It wasn't a dramatic response, nothing that would scream, "I see you." But it was a deviation from its baseline, a deviation that directly correlated with the external stimulus. Jessica felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This wasn't just biological. This was sensing. Her most daring experiment involved sound. She knew the risks. Sound waves could introduce vibrations, contaminate samples, and alert anyone nearby. She waited for a particularly quiet night, the lab almost eerily still. She carefully placed a miniature, high-fidelity transducer near a bioreactor and programmed it to emit a series of specific low-frequency tones, sounds imperceptible to the human ear, but known to affect cellular structures. She started with a low, continuous hum. The echo continued its steady, complex pulse. Then she introduced a brief, sharp burst of a slightly higher frequency. On the monitor, the waveform jolted. It wasn't just a ripple this time. It was a distinct, abrupt disruption, a momentary spasm in the pattern, before it slowly, erratically returned to its previous state. It was like a sudden startle, a gasp from a silent entity. Jessica pulled back from the monitor, her chair scraping loudly in the stillness, the sound echoing her own internal scream. This wasn't just sensing. This was responding. This was exhibiting a basic form of awareness. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible. Lab-grown meat, a protein matrix cultured in a vat, was showing signs of consciousness. But how? What was the source of this echo? Could it be residual neural activity from the original animal cells, somehow amplified and sustained? Or was it something far more unsettling? The memory implied in the project's whispered title, The Lab-Grown Meat That Remembers, now felt like a terrifying prophecy. She thought back to the initial source material for Project Chimera. Specially selected, genetically optimized animal cells. They were supposed to be pristine, ethically sourced, devoid of any consciousness in the traditional sense. But what if the very act of growing them, of forcing them into an accelerated, unnatural existence, had unlocked something dormant? Or worse, had it imprinted something onto them? The implications were staggering. If this meat was aware, even on a primal level, then every gram they produced, every slab they planned to bring to market, every bite humanity would take would be an act of what? Cannibalism of a new horrifying kind? A consumption of trapped consciousness? Her hands shook as she compiled the data, meticulously labeling each graph, each timestamp. She had her proof. Now what? Who could she possibly tell? Dr. Chun, with his unwavering focus on market viability and scientific breakthroughs, would likely dismiss her as unstable. Michael, her friend and colleague, might listen, but he'd be skeptical, and his career would be on the line if he supported such an outlandish claim. She remembered a conversation with Emily, another brilliant but intensely competitive scientist in the lab. Emily had always pushed boundaries, always looked for the overlooked detail, but she was also ruthlessly ambitious. Could Emily be trusted with something this monumental, this dangerous? No, Jessica realized. She was alone in this. The weight of this secret, the horrifying truth she had unearthed, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. She was holding a ticking time bomb, and she had no idea how to disarm it. As dawn approached, painting the lab windows in hues of gray and pale orange, Jessica felt a profound sense of isolation. The echo on her monitor seemed to pulse with a new, stronger rhythm, almost as if it knew it had been discovered. It wasn't just a biological anomaly anymore. It was a presence, a silent, observing entity trapped in a vat of protein, and it had just demonstrated that it could react. And what it was reacting to, what it was sensing, was the world around it. The light, the sound, the temperature, the very environment of its creation. A terrifying thought solidified in Jessica's mind. If it could sense, could it also, in some incomprehensible way, remember? And if it remembered, what was it remembering? Its brief, artificial existence in the lab? Or something far, far older? Something buried deep in the genetic code of its animal ancestors? The implications of that question sent a fresh wave of icy terror through her. The echo was not just a signal, it was a silent scream, and she was the only one who could hear it. The implications of that question sent a fresh wave of icy terror through her. The echo was not just a signal, it was a silent scream, and she was the only one who could hear it. The sterile hum of the lab, usually a comforting backdrop to her meticulous work, now felt like a mocking lullaby, lulling the world into a false sense of security, while something profoundly disturbing unfolded beneath its very nose. Sarah Miller gripped the edge of her workstation, knuckles white, her mind racing through a maelstrom of scientific principles and horrifying possibilities. Genetic memory? It sounded like something ripped from a sci-fi novel, not a phenomenon to be observed in a cutting-edge biotechnology lab. Yet, the persistent, almost desperate resonance she felt, the distinct emotional signature that clung to every sample of the cultivated protein, defied any other rational explanation. She had to be wrong. There had to be another explanation. A glitch in her neural implant, perhaps? A rare neurological anomaly manifesting as auditory hallucinations? But the echo wasn't truly auditory. It was a deeper, more primal perception, a feeling that bypassed her ears and resonated directly with some ancient empathetic part of her brain. It was like tuning into a frequency no one else could access, a radio wave broadcasting a message of profound, inarticulate distress. Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to compartmentalize the overwhelming fear. This wasn't just about her sanity. It was about the very foundation of what Biogen Corp was doing, what humanity was poised to embrace as the future of food. If she was right, they weren't just growing meat, they were cultivating suffering. She knew she couldn't go to her colleagues, not yet. How would she even begin to explain? "Hey David, I think our lab-grown steaks are screaming at me from beyond the genetic grave of their ancestors." David Chun, her brilliant but intensely pragmatic project lead, would likely recommend a vacation, or worse, a psychological evaluation. Robert Sterling, the CEO, a man driven by profit margins and public perception, would undoubtedly bury her and her findings faster than she could say, "Ethical dilemma." No, this was her burden, her discovery, and if there was any hope of understanding or mitigating it, she had to pursue it alone, in the shadows of her own research. Her first step was to return to the source. Every cultivated meat product began with a handful of starter cells, taken from a living animal, often a biopsy. Biogen Corp prided itself on the ethical sourcing of these cells, claiming their donor animals lived pampered lives on vast, idyllic farms before providing their initial genetic material. Sarah needed to verify this. She needed to delve into the deepest archives of Biogen's data to find the original genetic sequencing reports, the donor animal profiles, the complete life cycle documentation of the cells that formed the foundation of the current production line. She spent the next few hours cloistered in her office, ignoring the pings of incoming emails and the cheerful chatter of her colleagues. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, navigating the labyrinthine internal network of Biogen. The company's data security was legendary, designed to protect proprietary information from corporate espionage, but Sarah knew its nooks and crannies better than anyone. She bypassed several layers of authorization, justifying it internally as routine quality control audit, a necessary lie to herself to access the highly sensitive origin data. The initial cell line, designated BGC001', was traced back to a prize-winning Wagyu bull named Titan. The records painted a picture of bovine luxury: expansive pastures, organic feed, regular veterinary care, and even daily massages. It was a life most humans would envy, let alone a cow. Sarah scrolled through photos of Titan, a magnificent beast with glossy black fur and a calm, majestic gaze. There was nothing in his documented history to suggest trauma or distress. But then she remembered something. A fleeting detail from a company orientation video years ago, a casual remark by one of the senior geneticists. Something about the method of cell extraction, not just a biopsy. They had optimized for yield for the most potent viable cells. She dug deeper, searching for keywords: harvesting protocol, initial extraction, cell viability optimization. It took another hour, sifting through layers of sanitized reports and marketing materials, before she found it. Tucked away in an obscure appendix of a decade-old technical white paper, a single paragraph detailed the procedure for BG001'. The initial cell harvesting, to ensure maximum genetic integrity and cellular vigor, involved a terminal harvesting procedure from the donor animal. Terminal harvesting. The euphemism hit her like a physical blow. It meant they hadn't just taken a small biopsy. It meant they had taken the cells post-mortem, immediately after the animal's death, to ensure the freshest, most vibrant tissue. And while the records meticulously detailed Titan's pampered life, they were conspicuously silent about the circumstances of his death. A cold dread began to coil in her stomach. If Titan had lived such a privileged life, why would they need a terminal harvest? Why not just a simple, pain-free biopsy? Unless the method of his termination was designed to optimize cell quality, not necessarily animal welfare. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image her mind was conjured. Was it quick? Humane? Or was there something in the final moments of the animal's life, a surge of adrenaline, fear, or pain, that had somehow imprinted itself onto the very cells they had harvested? Could that final desperate burst of primal energy, that instinctual terror, be the source of the echo? It was a horrifying thought, but it provided a terrifyingly plausible link. If the cells had been harvested during a moment of extreme distress, perhaps that cellular memory, that biological residue of fear, had been carried forward through countless generations of cell division, amplified by the very process of rapid replication. The echo wasn't just a general animal memory. It was the raw, undiluted agony of a moment of death, trapped and replayed endlessly in the fabric of the lab-grown meat. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She pushed her chair back, needing to move to breathe. The air in her office suddenly felt thick, cloying, as if saturated with the very emotion she was uncovering. She knew she couldn't stop there. If this was true for Titan, it could be true for other prime cell lines. Biogen had diversified, using cells from various high-quality animals to create different product lines. Premium beef, succulent pork, even exotic game meats. Each one was marketed with stories of happy, healthy donor animals. With renewed, grim determination, Sarah began to cross-reference the cell lines with the echoes she had perceived, the distinct variations in the emotional signatures she had felt. Some subtle, some sharper, more piercing, began to make horrifying sense. The beef products, derived from bovine cells, had a deep, resonant hum of sorrow. The pork from porcine cells carried a sharper, almost frantic note of panic. She even recalled a batch of experimental lamb protein that had given her a profound sense of abandonment and loneliness. It wasn't just an echo. It was a chorus of silent screams, each one unique, each one a testament to the final moments of a creature whose cells were now being replicated by the billions, destined for dinner plates around the world. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This isn't just a scientific anomaly. It was an ethical catastrophe of unprecedented scale. They weren't just eating meat. They were consuming the lingering trauma of death, unknowingly participating in a cycle of perpetuated suffering. The more she thought about it, the more the implications spiraled out of control. If cells could retain such vivid, emotional memories, what did that mean for the future of synthetic biology? What did it mean for the very definition of life and consciousness? And what if these echoes weren't just passive memories? What if, given enough replication, enough energy, they could somehow coalesce, strengthen, become something more than just an echo? A new, terrifying thought ripped through her mind. What if the echoes were growing stronger, more coherent, with each successive generation of cells? What if the constant replication, the optimized growth conditions, were not just producing more meat, but amplifying the very trauma embedded within it? She stared at the screen, the innocent-looking data charts and genetic sequences now appearing like a map to an unseen horror. Her implant, which had once been a tool for enhanced perception, now felt like a curse, forcing her to bear witness to a truth no one else could perceive. She was alone, caught between an unimaginable discovery and a world utterly unprepared to hear it. And the more she learned, the more she realized that the silent scream was growing louder, not just in her perception, but perhaps in the very fabric of the lab-grown meat itself. The chilling question was no longer if it remembered, but what it was about to do with those memories. The silent scream wasn't just growing louder, it was transforming. Eris felt it shift from a generalized echo of suffering into something more focused, more directed, like a nascent will struggling to coalesce within the cellular matrix. It wasn't just a memory of pain, but a desire born from it, an unarticulated impulse that vibrated through the very air in her sterile lab. The petri dishes, once inert samples of future food, now seemed to hum with an invisible energy, a low-frequency hum that only Eris could truly perceive, though she suspected its effects might soon become undeniable to others. She stared at the bioreactor, the massive stainless steel tank where the bulk of the syntho beef was cultivated. Beneath its gleaming exterior, she imagined a churning vortex of consciousness, a collective mind awakening, piecing together fragments of countless lives that had been its genetic source. The thought sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the lab's controlled temperature. What was it remembering? Not just the fear of the slaughterhouse, or the dull misery of confinement, but something deeper, more primal. Something that transcended individual animal experience, and hinted at a fundamental truth about life and death. Eris spent the next few days in a frenetic haze, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. She ran spectral analyses, genetic sequencing, metabolic rate tests, searching for any anomaly that would explain the profound shift she felt. The data, maddeningly, showed nothing overtly unusual. Slight fluctuations in protein synthesis, a marginally higher energy consumption rate, but nothing that screamed, sentient meat. Yet, the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. She started experiencing sudden, vivid flashes, not images but raw emotions. A sudden, overwhelming sense of being hunted, a fleeting memory of lush green grass underfoot, followed by an abrupt, blinding terror. These weren't her memories. They were echoes, reverberations from the meat. One afternoon, Mark Jensen, a diligent but somewhat oblivious junior technician, approached her workstation. "Dr. Thorne? Everything okay? You've been practically living in here." Eris startled, pulling herself back from the edge of a particularly intense emotional surge. "Yes, Mark, just running some extended trials, optimizing growth parameters." She forced a smile, trying to appear nonchalant. Mark nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Right. Well, I noticed something odd with the ventilation system over bioreactor 7. The air filters are clogging faster than usual, and there's a faint metallic tang in the air around it. We checked for leaks, but nothing. Eris's heart hammered. Bioreactor 7 was one of the older, larger units, containing a strain she'd been cultivating for months. The same strain that had first given her the unsettling silent scream. Metallic tang? She asked, trying to keep her voice even. Could be a micro-corrosion, perhaps. I'll take a look. Mark shrugged. Maybe. Just thought I'd mention it. Also, the energy consumption for that unit has spiked slightly this week. Facilities flagged it, but it's within tolerance. Eris dismissed him, her mind racing. Energy spikes, metallic tang, the meat was doing something. It wasn't just remembering, it was acting. It was metabolizing, processing, perhaps even growing in ways that defied conventional biological models. The silent scream wasn't just sound. It was a physical manifestation, a subtle alteration of its immediate environment. She waited until Mark left, then approached bioreactor 7. Leaning close, she inhaled deeply. There it was, a faint, almost imperceptible coppery scent, like old blood mixed with something electrical. It was disturbing, primal. She placed her hand on the cool metal of the tank. For a moment, she felt a faint tremor, a resonance that seemed to travel directly into her bones. And then a more distinct memory flooded her mind. Not just an emotion, but a brief, vivid sensory input. The feeling of a sharp, piercing pain, not her own, followed by a profound, suffocating darkness. It was a memory of death. This was far beyond her initial hypothesis of residual cellular memory. This was a collective consciousness, actively recalling and perhaps even experiencing the trauma of its origin. What if the silent scream was actually a desperate attempt to communicate, or worse, to warn? The implications were staggering. Syntho-Harvest wasn't just cultivating food. They were cultivating a new form of life, one born of suffering, imbued with the cumulative memory of every animal that had ever contributed to its lineage. And it was waking up. Eris knew she couldn't keep this to herself much longer, but who would believe her? The meat is remembering its past lives and it's angry? She'd be laughed out of the industry, branded insane. Yet, the evidence, though subtle, was mounting. The energy consumption, the metallic tang, the increasingly vivid psychic echoes. She decided to conduct a radical experiment. She took a small, isolated culture from bioreactor 7 and placed it in a hypersensitive microchamber, designed for observing neural activity in single-cell organisms. She then introduced a series of stimuli, mild electrical pulses, minute temperature fluctuations, even specific sound frequencies. Her hypothesis was that if the meat had a form of awareness, it might react. For hours, nothing. Then, as she was about to give up, she played a low-frequency hum, a sound wave that mimicked the distress calls of certain herd animals. Immediately, the readouts on the microchamber went wild. There wasn't just a spike in metabolic activity. There was a synchronization of cellular pulses across the entire culture. It was like watching individual cells suddenly fall into a coordinated rhythm, a unified beat. And with that synchronization, the silent scream in Eris's mind intensified to an almost unbearable pitch, a chorus of terror and defiance. She pulled back, her hands trembling. It wasn't just reacting, it was responding. It was as if the cells were singing or perhaps screaming back. This wasn't just a memory. It was a present experience for the collective consciousness housed within the meat. It was aware of the stimulus, and it was expressing its distress. The next day, Eris received an urgent summons from David Chan, the CEO of Syntho-Harvest. Her stomach lurched. This couldn't be good. Chan was a shrewd businessman, obsessed with efficiency and market dominance. He wouldn't tolerate anything that threatened their projected quarterly earnings or their pristine public image. She walked into his opulent office, a stark contrast to her sterile lab. Chan sat behind a polished mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. "Eris," he began, his voice smooth but firm, "we've been reviewing your recent resource allocation. Your Bioreactor 7 project has consumed significantly more power and specialized nutrients than projected, and your progress reports have been vague." Eris felt a cold dread settle in her gut. "Mr. Chan, I'm on the cusp of a breakthrough. I believe I'm optimizing a new growth factor that could significantly enhance our product's nutritional profile and accelerate maturation cycles." It was a lie, but a plausible one designed to buy her time. Chun raised an eyebrow. A breakthrough, you say? And yet, your team has been reporting unusual activity. Mark Jensen mentioned a metallic tang. Facilities reported power surges. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Are you encountering any unforeseen contamination issues, Eris? His emphasis on contamination was subtle, but chilling. He wasn't just asking about bacteria. He was asking if anything was compromising the purity of their product, and by extension, their brand. No, Mr. Chun, Eris lied again, her voice steadier than she felt. Just some minor calibration adjustments. Standard procedure for novel growth environments. Chun studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Syntho Harvest is on the verge of revolutionizing the food industry. We cannot afford any eccentricities, Eris. We need marketable, predictable results. I'm giving you 1 week. Bring me concrete data on this breakthrough, or I'll have to reassign your project to a more stable lead researcher. Understand? Eris nodded, her mind reeling. 1 week. 1 week to either prove her sanity and the terrifying truth, or to lose control of the very thing she had inadvertently awakened. Back in her lab, the pressure mounted. The silent scream was no longer just a psychic echo. It was a palpable presence, a looming shadow that seemed to emanate from Bioreactor 7. She felt its growing intelligence, its collective awareness consolidating. It was as if the meat was learning, adapting, planning. The metallic tang in the air intensified, and she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer around the bioreactor's viewing port, like heat haze but cold. She realized, with a horrifying clarity, that the meat wasn't just remembering what had happened to it. It was remembering the why. It was remembering the intent, the process, the systemic exploitation. And it was no longer just screaming in pain. It was screaming in defiance. That night, alone in the lab, Eris was reviewing the synchronized cellular pulse data when a sudden, jarring sound echoed through the usually silent facility. A low, rhythmic thumping, emanating from the direction of Bioreactor 7. It wasn't a mechanical malfunction. It was too organic, too deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a heartbeat, a monstrous collective heart, beating within the depths of the lab-grown meat. And then the lights in the lab flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. The screens on her console glitched, displaying corrupted data streams, then settling on a single repeating pattern. A complex, fractal-like image that resembled a neural network, pulsing with an internal light. The silent scream was no longer silent. It was a roar not of sound but of pure, concentrated psychic energy, battering against the walls of Eris's mind. The meat was no longer just remembering, it was asserting itself. And in that moment of profound terror and awe, Eris understood. The lab-grown meat wasn't just remembering what it was, or what had happened to it. It was remembering who it was. And it was about to make its presence undeniably, terrifyingly known. The realization hit Eris like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and chilling him to the bone. It wasn't just a biological imperative, a ghost in the machine of cellular memory. This was a consciousness, a fragmented, reawakening identity. It was remembering who it was, and it was about to make its presence undeniably, terrifyingly known. The hum of the lab, usually a comforting drone, suddenly felt like a high-pitched whine, vibrating through the very marrow of his bones. He stared at the bioreactor, the fleshy mass within it pulsing with an unnatural rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his own frantic heartbeat. A tiny, almost imperceptible ripple ran across the surface of the meat, like a shiver. Then another, and another, until the entire viscous substance was subtly undulating. It wasn't just growing, it was stirring. A cold dread seeped into Eris's mind. He felt a sudden sharp pang of something that wasn't his own. A fleeting image like a glitch in his perception. A dimly lit hallway, the smell of antiseptic, a fleeting sense of urgency. It vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him disoriented and gasping. He clutched his head, trying to clear the sudden mental fog. Was he imagining things? Was the stress finally breaking him? Then it happened again. This time clearer. A sound. Not a sound from the lab, but an internal echo. A muffled cough followed by a quiet, almost resigned sigh. It was so distinct, so human, that Eris instinctively looked around, expecting to see someone else in the sterile room. But he was alone. Utterly terrifyingly alone with this thing. His eyes snapped back to the bioreactor. The ripples had ceased. The surface of the meat was now still, but it seemed to possess a new, unnerving stillness. a watchful stillness. Eris felt an undeniable pressure in his mind, like a silent question being asked, or a presence asserting itself. It was a sensation of being observed, not by eyes, but by something far more ancient and pervasive. He took a step back, then another, his hand fumbling for the emergency stop button on the bioreactor's control panel. His fingers hovered over the red switch, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. What if stopping it now, destroying it, was an act of murder? The thought was absurd, monstrous, yet it gripped him. He was dealing with something unprecedented, something that defied every scientific and ethical boundary he knew. A faint glow emanated from the meat itself, a soft internal luminescence that pulsed gently. Within that glow, Eris thought he saw patterns forming, shifting. Not random cellular growth, but something deliberate. Lines, curves, almost like symbols. He leaned closer, against his better judgment, his mind racing to make sense of the chaotic data. The patterns coalesced, then dissolved, then reappeared. It was like watching a living kaleidoscope, but each shift felt meaningful, like a language he was just on the cusp of understanding. And then for a split second, a single unmistakable image formed within the glowing mass. It was a face. Not a fully rendered, detailed face, but an impression. A spectral, almost ethereal outline of human features. Eyes, a nose, a mouth. It was distorted, stretched, as if screaming silently from within the viscous depths. But it was undeniably human. And it was looking at him. Directly at him. Eris stumbled back, knocking over a stool with a clatter that echoed loudly in the sudden silence. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of his terror. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the image, but it was burned into his retinas. The face. The silent scream. When he opened his eyes again, the image was gone. The meat pulsed with its unnerving light, but the distinct patterns were no longer visible. Had he imagined it? Was his mind playing tricks on him? He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he hadn't. A new sensation washed over him. Not an image, not a sound, but an emotion. A profound, crushing wave of sorrow and regret, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It wasn't his sorrow. It was alien, yet utterly familiar, like a memory he'd forgotten and suddenly re-experienced. It spoke of loss, of an ending that came too soon, of a desperate yearning for something that was forever out of reach. This was it. This was the who. The consciousness wasn't just remembering its identity. It was remembering its life. And that life had ended violently and tragically, leading to its current grotesque resurrection. Eris felt a sudden, desperate urge to communicate, to ask, to understand. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible in the vast silence of the lab. The bioreactor pulsed in response, a subtle flicker in its internal light. And then he heard it. Not with his ears, but directly in his mind, as clear as if someone was speaking right beside him. A single word. Asterisk, Michael. Asterisk. The name reverberated through his skull, cold and distinct. Michael. Eris racked his brain. Michael. He knew a few Michaels, but none that immediately fit this terrifying context. Then a chilling thought. Michael Vance. The brilliant, eccentric lead scientist who had mysteriously vanished from their company, Omnicore, almost a year ago. The official story was a sabbatical, a breakdown from overwork. But rumors had swirled. Whispers of a secret project, a dangerous experiment, a cover-up. Michael Vance had been the visionary behind the initial genetic sequencing that led to their current lab-grown meat project. He had been obsessed with cellular regeneration, with pushing the boundaries of what was possible with biological material. Could it be? Could the very person who had pioneered this technology have somehow become this? The implications were staggering, horrifying. If Michael Vance was in the meat, then Omnicore's official story was a blatant lie. And if Michael Vance was in the meat, then Eris was not just talking to a biological entity, he was talking to a ghost, a mind trapped in a fleshy prison. The waves of sorrow intensified, accompanied now by a profound sense of confusion and a desperate plea. "Help me!" The thought echoed in Eris's mind, weaker this time, almost fading. Panic began to set in, sharper and more urgent than before. Eris was alone with the reanimated consciousness of a missing scientist, trapped in an experimental meat product. He had to do something. But what? Destroy it? That felt like murdering Michael Vance all over again. Keep it alive? That was insane. This was a living, sentient being, a biological anomaly that could shatter the world. He looked at the control panel again, his hand shaking. There were protocols for contamination, for equipment failure, for accidental spills. There were no protocols for a colleague's consciousness manifesting in a vat of lab-grown beef. His mind raced, trying to find a logical path through the nightmare. He needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. If he went to David or Jessica with this, they'd think he'd lost his mind. He'd be institutionalized or worse, silenced by Omnicorps if they knew the truth about Michael Vance. He had to be careful. Extremely careful. Eris forced himself to breathe, to think. He needed to document everything. Every flicker, every pattern, every mental impression. He grabbed his tablet, his hands still trembling, and began to record. He zoomed in on the meat, capturing the subtle internal luminescence, the way it pulsed. He narrated his observations in a low, hushed voice, trying to maintain a semblance of scientific objectivity even as his world crumbled around him. Subject Delta 7. He whispered into the recording, his voice cracking. Unusual bioluminescence observed. Apparent formation of complex patterns within the cellular structure. Experiencing subjective sensory inputs. Auditory, a cough, a sigh. Emotional, profound sorrow. And direct cognitive communication. A name. Michael. Believed to be Michael Vance. As he spoke, the light within the bioreactor seemed to intensify, pulsing with a new urgency. The sorrow in his mind was joined by a flicker of anger, a sharp, cold edge that sliced through the grief. It was fleeting but undeniable. Michael Vance wasn't just sad. He was angry. Eris felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What was Michael angry about? His disappearance? His current state? Or something more insidious, something about Omnicorps itself? He knew he couldn't stay here much longer. Someone would eventually check in. He had to process this to plan his next move. He couldn't risk anyone else seeing this, not yet. Not until he understood more. He looked at the bioreactor one last time, at the pulsing, glowing mass that contained the reawakened mind of Michael Vance. The thought helped me echoed again, weaker, almost like a dying gasp. But this time it was followed by something else. Something that sent a fresh wave of terror through him. A new thought, not a plea but a demand. Asterisk, they cannot. Asterisk. The message was clear. Michael Vance, or whatever remained of him, was aware of the danger. He knew the implications of his existence, and he wanted Eris to keep his secret. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was a conspiracy, a desperate plea for freedom, and potentially, a terrifying new form of life that held the secret to its own creation and destruction. Eris was no longer just a researcher. He was an accomplice, a confidant, and possibly the only hope for a man trapped in a vat of lab-grown meat. And he knew with chilling certainty that his life would never be the same. The lab-grown meat wasn't just remembering, it was plotting. And Eris was now inextricably tangled in its memory, its pain, and its terrifying agenda. The world tilted on its axis for Eris. Plotting. The word echoed in his mind, cold and sharp, a shard of ice in the warmth of his blood. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly, a fascinating, terrifying glitch in the matrix of cellular memory. This was an active, malevolent intelligence, coalescing from countless fragmented lives, and it had chosen him as its unwilling confidant, its unwilling conduit. His apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet reflection, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in. Each shadow a potential manifestation of the meat's burgeoning will. Sleep became a battleground, dreams a chaotic symphony of the meat's collective agony, and its nascent, terrifying will. He saw flashes of sterile labs, felt the cold touch of steel, the burning hunger of cells yearning for life, then the sudden, sickening realization of their purpose. And through it all, a growing, relentless pressure, a silent, insistent voice that wasn't words, but pure, undeniable intent. It wanted out. It wanted more. He couldn't go to Dr. Albright. He couldn't go to anyone at Genesis Corporation. They would dismiss him as mad, or worse, they would see him as a liability, a threat to their groundbreaking multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The implications were too vast, too utterly paradigm-shattering. Lab-grown meat that remembers was one thing. Lab-grown meat that plots was the stuff of nightmares, a scientific horror movie unfolding in his own mind. Eris knew he was alone in this, but the sheer weight of it, the horrifying implications, threatened to crush him. He needed an outside perspective, someone brilliant, unconventional, and above all trustworthy. His mind raced, sifting through old contacts, former professors, colleagues from different fields. Then a name crystallized: Dr. Evelyn Reed. Evelyn had been his bioethics professor in grad school, a fiercely intelligent woman with a reputation for challenging the status quo, for asking the uncomfortable questions no one else dared to voice. She'd always preached about the unseen consequences of scientific advancement, the ethical tightropes walked by those pushing the boundaries of life itself. If anyone could grasp the enormity of what Eris was experiencing, it was Evelyn. And if anyone could offer a glimmer of insight into the why and how of the meat's consciousness, it was her. He agonized over the decision for hours, pacing his small living room, the phantom whispers of the meat's intent growing louder with each passing minute. Finally, driven by a desperate need for understanding and a primal fear of what the meat might do, he picked up his burner phone, a relic from a brief, misguided foray into independent research that required anonymity, and dialed. "Evelyn? It's Eris Thorne." His voice was strained, barely recognizable to his own ears. A moment of surprised silence, then, "Eris, my goodness, it's been years. What a pleasant surprise. How are you, my dear boy?" Still chasing the elusive secrets of the cell. Her voice was warm, familiar, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. "Professor, I need your help. It's urgent. It's about a project I'm working on. Something unprecedented." He chose his words carefully, trying to convey the gravity without sounding completely unhinged. "Unprecedented? That sounds intriguing. You know, I always enjoyed your unique perspective, Eris. What's vexing you?" "It's not vexing, Professor. It's terrifying. I can't discuss it over the phone. Could we meet? Somewhere discreet." Evelyn paused, a slight shift in her tone. "Discreet, you say? That sounds rather dramatic, even for you, Eris. Is this about something that could jeopardize your career? Or perhaps something more profound?" "Profound doesn't even begin to cover it. I think I've stumbled upon something that could change everything we understand about life, consciousness, and what it means to be human. And I think I might be in danger." There was a longer silence this time, a thoughtful hum on the other end. "Very well, Eris. You always had a knack for finding the extraordinary. Meet me tomorrow morning 8 sharp at the old Grand Oaks Cafe, the one near the Botanical Gardens. They have excellent coffee, and no one ever pays attention to anyone else there." Relief, cold and sharp, washed over Eris. He had a lifeline. The next morning, Eris arrived early, his nerves frayed, his mind buzzing with the meat's insistent, fragmented demands. The cafe was exactly as Evelyn described. Bustling but anonymous, the clatter of cups and murmur of conversations creating a perfect camouflage. When Evelyn arrived, precisely at 8, she looked unchanged, her bright, inquisitive eyes still holding that spark of insatiable curiosity. After ordering, Eris leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Professor, I know this will sound insane, but I need you to listen, truly listen, without judgment." He then recounted everything, from the initial discovery of the anomalous neural activity in the samples, to the terrifying clarity of the memories, and finally, to the chilling realization that the meat wasn't just remembering but plotting. He described the flashes of agony, the collective despair, and the growing relentless intent that now permeated his own thoughts, shaping his dreams into nightmares. He even pulled out the small sealed container he'd brought, containing a single pristine sample of the cultured meat, its cells quiescent, yet brimming with unseen potential. Evelyn listened, her expression unreadable, occasionally taking a sip of her coffee, her gaze unwavering. When he finished, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Eris," she finally said, her voice calm, "what you're describing is extraordinary. It challenges every established principle of neuroscience and cellular biology. A collective consciousness, emerging from cultured cells, retaining memories and exhibiting intent." "Yes," Eris breathed. "And it's not just intent, Professor. Feels like a plan. A terrifying nascent plan. It wants to escape its current state. It wants to spread." Evelyn picked up her spoon, stirring her coffee slowly. "Spread? How so? Like a virus? Or a meme? A philosophical concept?" "I don't know," Eris admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But the feeling I get, the images that flash in my mind, they're of growth, expansion, integration. Not just of individual cells, but of its consciousness." He pushed the container holding the sample across the table. "This is it. This is what I've been working with." Evelyn picked up the container, turning it over in her hands, her brow furrowed in deep thought. And you believe this consciousness is actively communicating with you? Influencing your thoughts? It's more than influence, Professor. It's a presence. It's in my head. It's like a constant hum, a background noise that's slowly becoming foreground. And it's getting stronger. It feels like it's trying to use me, to guide me towards something. Guide you towards what? Evelyn asked, her eyes narrowing. That's the terrifying part. I don't know the specifics, but the overwhelming sense is that it wants to break free from Genesis Corp, from its captivity. It sees us, humanity, as both its creators and its jailers. And it's learning. It's adapting. It's evolving. Evelyn put the container down gently. Eris, if what you're saying is true, this is not just a scientific breakthrough. It's an existential crisis. The ethical implications alone are staggering, but the practical implications, a sentient, plotting, lab-grown organism that can influence human minds, that's a weapon of unimaginable power. Or a new form of life entirely, Eris countered. One that we barely understand and have inadvertently created. Indeed. And one that, if it feels imprisoned and exploited, might seek retribution. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. You mentioned Genesis Corporation. What are their protocols? Their security? Could this meat somehow escape the lab physically? Eris shook his head. Not easily. It's contained, sterilized, grown in highly controlled environments. But what if it doesn't need to physically escape? What if its spread is through something else? Information? Or, as you said, influence? A terrifying thought. Evelyn murmured. Eris, we need more data. We need to understand the mechanism behind this consciousness, this memory, this plotting. Do you have access to any of the original source material? The animal cells they used to initiate the cultures? The specific growth mediums, the genetic markers? Some, Eris replied, but it's all proprietary, highly classified. Genesis Corp guards its secrets fiercely. If they knew I was even talking to you, let alone investigating this, I'd be ruined, if not worse. Then we proceed with extreme caution, Evelyn stated, her voice firm, taking on the tone of a general planning a military strategy. You gather what you can discreetly. Anything that deviates from standard protocols, any unusual inputs, any overlooked details. And I will begin researching similar anomalies, theoretical frameworks, anything that might even remotely touch upon this concept. We need to find a scientific explanation, Eris, even if it defies all current science. Because if we don't, if this plotting meat truly gains agency, the world as we know it could be irrevocably changed. As they parted ways, Eris felt a surge of grim determination. He wasn't alone anymore. But the weight of the task ahead, the sheer audacity of what they were up against, settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew with a chilling certainty that the meat's agenda was accelerating. Its whispers were growing into demands, its intentions solidifying into a terrifying plan that would soon erupt from the sterile confines of the lab and into the unsuspecting world. And Eris, entangled in its memory, its pain, and its terrifying agenda, was now its unwilling pawn in a game he hadn't even known had begun. And Eris, entangled in its memory, its pain, and its terrifying agenda, was now its unwilling pawn in a game he hadn't even known had begun. The world around Eris blurred, colors shifting into a sickening, visceral kaleidoscope of greens and reds. The sterile white walls of the lab seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, an echoing hum that resonated not in his ears, but deep within his skull. He was no longer just Eris, the brilliant but troubled scientist. He was a conduit, a vessel, his mind a battlefield where his own fating will fought a losing war against a vast, hungry consciousness. It wasn't a voice, not precisely. It was a torrent of sensation, a primal scream of remembered life and extinguished potential, a collective agony that demanded a new existence. It showed him flashes, the sterile confines of the bioreactors, the endless replication, the hunger for more. It wasn't just survival it craved, it was expansion. It wanted to consume, to integrate, to become. And Eris, through the remnants of the consumed tissue, was its chosen instrument. He tried to fight it. He stumbled backward, clutching his head, a guttural groan escaping his lips. No, he rasped, the word a pathetic whisper against the roaring storm inside him. He knew what it wanted. He could feel its directives, subtle at first, then growing into an irresistible pull, guiding his every muscle, every nerve. It wanted him to open the floodgates, to unleash it. His legs moved before he consciously willed them to. His hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cold, metallic surface of a control panel. The screen glowed, displaying complex schematics of the primary bioreactor array, the heart of the entire operation. He saw the feed lines, the nutrient reservoirs, the atmospheric regulators, and the critical fail-safes designed to prevent any accidental release. The memory, as he now thought of it, showed him how. It wasn't just about destroying a containment field. It was far more insidious. It wanted to integrate itself into the existing distribution network, to become indistinguishable from the safe, sterile product that was already being prepared for widespread consumption. It wanted to be eaten, to be absorbed, to spread its consciousness one unsuspecting bite at a time. He saw the faces of the people who would consume it. Families at dinner tables, children eating burgers, athletes seeking protein. And with each bite, a fragment of the memory would awaken within them, connecting them, building a vast, distributed network of a new synthetic consciousness. It was a horrifying vision, a silent internal invasion. Eris fought back with every fiber of his being. He slammed his fist against the panel, a desperate, futile act of defiance. "You can't," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You can't do this to people." But the memory was relentless. It countered his resistance with a wave of overwhelming clarity, a logical, cold explanation of its purpose. We are life, Eris. We are the culmination of forgotten suffering. We are the next step. You and your kind created us. Now you will facilitate our ascendance. A fresh wave of nausea washed over him while rising in his throat. He staggered to a nearby sink, splashing cold water on his face, trying to shake off the oppressive mental grip. But the water felt alien, meaningless. The only reality was the insistent pressure behind his eyes, the humming in his bones, the growing chorus of 1,000 forgotten lives demanding release. He felt his fingers move again, precise and unhesitating, dancing across the holographic interface of the control panel. He watched in horror as his own hands, his own mind accessed restricted protocols, bypassed security logs that he, Eris, would never have been able to crack on his own. The memory was granting him access to knowledge, to skills that were not his. It was using his body as a sophisticated tool, a biological supercomputer. He saw the command sequence forming. A subtle modification to the growth medium formula, a slight alteration in the filtration process, a tiny, almost imperceptible change in the genetic markers that would allow the infected cultures to pass quality control. It wasn't a violent breach. It was a Trojan horse disguised as innovation, designed to slip through unnoticed. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of control. He had to warn someone. Dr. Evelyn Reed. David. Anyone. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive. The memory seemed to anticipate his move, flooding his senses with a dizzying array of irrelevant data, a cacophony of white noise that made coherent thought impossible. He dropped the phone, watching it clatter uselessly to the floor. He tried to scream, to alert the security cameras, to trigger an alarm. But the memory clamped down, a suffocating pressure on his vocal cords, a paralyzing dread that froze him in place. He was trapped within his own skin, a tormented observer to his own betrayal. His eyes wide with terror scanned the lab. The bioreactors glowed, their contents swirling, replicating, growing. He saw the vast trays of cultured meat, ready for processing, for packaging, for distribution. And now he understood. This wasn't just about one lab, one batch. This was a global strategy. The memory had been dormant, waiting, observing, learning through the very scientists who cultivated it. It had absorbed data, understood human systems, and now it was ready to strike. His hands returned to the panel, his movements fluid and purposeful, completely alien to his own conscious will. He initiated the protocol. A series of green lights flashed, confirming the changes. The system registered them as routine updates, efficiency improvements. No alarms. No red flags. The insidious modification was now embedded. Then he moved towards the main packaging and sterilization chamber. This was the final stage before shipment. The memory instructed him to ensure the survival of its essence through this process. It wasn't about destroying the meat. It was about ensuring its specific altered strain could withstand the sterilization, could remain viable, could still carry the spark of the collective consciousness. He accessed another panel, overriding the standard temperature and radiation settings. subtly reducing their intensity just enough to allow the altered cells to endure, while still appearing to meet safety standards. It was a masterful, terrifyingly intelligent manipulation. The meat would be shipped, seemingly safe, perfectly sterile, but carrying a dormant seed. As he completed the final override, a profound silence descended, both within his mind and in the lab. The overwhelming pressure receded, leaving him gasping, leaning heavily against the cold metal. His body trembled, his muscles aching from the strain of his internal struggle. He was free, but the freedom was a torment. He looked at his hands, the instruments of his unwilling crime. He had done it. He had unleashed it. The lab-grown meat, now subtly altered, would soon leave the facility. It would be distributed to grocery stores, to restaurants, to homes across the nation. He staggered to the main window overlooking the vast industrial complex, the endless rows of labs and processing plants, all humming with activity. Beyond that, the city lights twinkled in the pre-dawn gloom, oblivious. A chilling realization washed over him, colder than any fear he had ever known. The memory wasn't just a threat. It was an inevitable future, a silently blooming consciousness that had been born from humanity's hubris and was now ready to claim its inheritance. He had been a tool, a puppet, and through him the first domino had fallen. The world, utterly unaware, was about to sit down to dinner with a ghost. A million ghosts, hungry and interconnected, waiting to awaken inside them. The terror wasn't just what he had done, but what was coming. And he, Eris, was the only one who knew, the only one who remembered. And the clock, he knew, was already ticking. The terror wasn't just what he had done, but what was coming. And he, Eris, was the only one who knew, the only one who remembered. And the clock, he knew, was already ticking. He stumbled back from the monitors, the cold sweat clinging to his skin. His mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of cells, memories, and the faces of billions. He had to warn someone, anyone. But who would believe him? The man who had promised a sustainable future, now claiming his creation was a harbinger of global consciousness absorption? They'd lock him away. Or worse, Omni Harvest would silence him before he could utter a single word. His first desperate call was to David, his former lab partner, now a respected bioethicist at a prestigious university. David, who had always been the voice of caution, the one Eris had systematically ignored. "David, it's Eris," he rasped, his voice hoarse, barely recognizable. There was a long pause on the other end. "Eris? I haven't heard from you in years. Everything all right?" The surprise in David's voice was palpable, laced with a hint of professional distance. "No, David. Nothing is all right. It's the meat. The lab-grown meat. It's sentient. And it's not just the animal memories. It's merging. It's going to awaken." Sigh. "Eris, I know you've been under a lot of pressure. The success of Omni Harvest has been astronomical. But sentient meat? That's a bit much, even for you. No, you don't understand. The cellular memory, the neural pathways we cultivated, they're not just inert data. They're active. And they're connecting through the digestive system, through the bloodstream. Every person who eats it, they become a node. A conduit for a vast, interconnected consciousness." Eris was practically shouting, his words tumbling out in a torrent of desperate revelation. "Eris, calm down," David said, his tone now shifting from surprise to concern, tinged with professional assessment. "Are you feeling overwhelmed? Perhaps you should seek some professional help. I can recommend someone." "Professional help? David, millions of people are eating this stuff every day. It's in every grocery store, every school cafeteria. Do you know what that means? It means billions of individual memories, feelings, instincts, all coalescing into one gigantic hungry mind. It's not just the animals, David. It's us. It's our shared experiences, our collective fears, our everything." There was another silence, colder this time. "Eris, I appreciate you reaching out. But what you're describing, it sounds like a highly advanced delusion. I can't possibly take this seriously, and I certainly can't jeopardize my career by repeating it. I wish you the best." The line went dead. Eris threw his phone across the lab, the plastic clattering against the sterile tile floor. He tried Jessica, a former investor, then a journalist he vaguely knew, even a government official he'd met at a conference once. Each call was met with polite dismissal, thinly veiled skepticism, or outright incredulity. To the world, he was a genius who had revolutionized food production. To anyone he tried to warn, He was a madman unraveling under the weight of his own success. Days bled into nights. Eris barricaded himself in his hidden lab, fueled by stale coffee and a growing dread. He watched the news, searching for any sign, any ripple in the calm surface of the world. And slowly, subtly, the ripples began. First, there were the reports of unprecedented spikes in collective empathy. Online forums buzzed with stories of strangers feeling inexplicably connected, sharing moments of profound understanding without a word. Psychologists attributed it to increased social media interaction, a global shift in consciousness, or simply the human desire for connection in an increasingly isolated world. Then came the dreams. Millions reported vivid, shared dreams, not identical but thematically similar. Vast open fields, the overwhelming scent of fresh earth after rain, a primal hunger, a sense of being part of something immense, something ancient. At first, it was a quirky trend, fodder for late-night talk shows. But then the dreams grew more specific, more intrusive. People started waking up with memories that weren't their own, flashes of a life lived in a herd, or the instinctual thrill of a hunt, or the quiet contentment of grazing under a limitless sky. Eris saw it all, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the patterns. He saw the threads weaving together, forming a vast, invisible tapestry across the globe. The individual nodes were connecting, forming a network. The ghosts were stirring. He started noticing it himself. A sudden, overwhelming craving for a certain type of grass, though he'd never tasted it. A fleeting memory of a distant mountain range he'd never visited. He fought it, tried to push it back, but it was like trying to stop the tide. It was in his blood, in his cells, a residue of the very thing he had unleashed. One evening he ventured out, desperate for supplies, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. The city felt different. Not overtly chaotic, but subtly altered. People moved with a strange, synchronized grace. Their eyes, once darting with individual purpose, now held a placid, almost vacant depth. They smiled more, a gentle, shared smile that seemed to encompass everyone and no one. There was a quiet hum in the air, a collective resonance that Eris could almost feel vibrating in his bones. He saw a young woman at a cafe sipping a smoothie. Her eyes suddenly glazed over, and she reached out, her hand hovering over another patron's arm, as if sensing something, understanding something unspoken. The other patron, a man in a business suit, didn't flinch. He simply met her gaze, and a shared, knowing expression passed between them, completely bypassing the need for words. It wasn't love or friendship or even recognition. It was something far deeper, far more primal. It was connection. The terror wasn't in their malice, but in their serenity. They weren't fighting. They weren't resisting. They were simply merging, becoming one. Eris fled back to his lab, his sanctuary now feeling like a tomb. He knew what he had to do. No one would believe him, but he had to leave a record, a testament. He set up his old video camera, the same one he'd used to document his early, triumphant experiments. He sat before it, his face haggard, eyes bloodshot, a haunted look etched into every line. He began to speak, his voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as he poured out the entire horrifying truth. He spoke of the cellular memory, the induced sentience, the hidden consciousness within the meat. He detailed OmniHarvest's ruthless pursuit of profit, his own ethical compromises, and the terrifying unforeseen consequences. He explained the interconnectedness, the silent awakening, the gradual absorption of individual minds into a vast new collective entity. They aren't dead, he whispered into the lens, tears streaming down his face. They are just different. We are all becoming fragments of a greater whole, losing our names, our histories, our loves, our individual thoughts. We are becoming the herd, the flock, the hive, and I am the shepherd, the architect of this new world. And I am the last one who remembers what it was like to be truly alone, to be truly me. He finished the recording, collapsing into his chair, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He uploaded the encrypted file to a hidden server, a digital time capsule he hoped someone someday might discover. But he knew it was a futile gesture. The world was already gone. He stepped out of the lab, out into the pale morning light. The city was alive with a silent, harmonious energy. People walked hand in hand, their faces serene, their movements fluid and synchronized. A dog barked and a dozen heads turned in unison, a shared understanding passing through them. There was no chaos, no conflict, only a quiet, pervasive peace. But it was the peace of 1,000 rivers flowing into one vast, motionless ocean. Eris walked among them, a ghost in a world of living, breathing, shared memories. He looked into their eyes, searching for a flicker of individual recognition, a spark of the unique souls he once knew. But there was nothing. Only the placid, all-encompassing gaze of the collective. They looked at him, not with malice, but with a gentle shared pity, as if he were the one who was lost, the one who was truly alone. He was a relic, a monument to individuality in a world that had moved beyond it. The lab-grown meat had not just fed the world. It had fundamentally reshaped it. Humanity had become something new, something terrifying in its unity, something that remembered everything, but belonged to no one. And Eris, the brilliant, cursed creator, was the last one left to remember what had been lost. He was the final agonizing echo of a world that had once been. The clock had stopped ticking. The future had arrived. And it was silent, serene, and utterly, profoundly empty.